plan to share are from John Gibb Millspaugh. Leave aside the little thoughts that distract you. For this place, like all places, is a holy place. And now, like all times, is a holy time. Join with this community of seekers, and together let us find. Is in honor of the weather and our Earthism by Langston Hughes. It will probably be familiar. In the time of silver rain, the earth puts forth new life again. Green grasses grow and flowers lift their heads. And over all the plain, the wonder spreads of life, of life, of life. In time of silver rain, the butterflies lift silken wings to catch a rainbow cry, and trees put forth new leaves to sing in joy beneath the sky, when spring and life are new. Colleen Reinke. I promised I would say certain things and not other things, but so you may know that Colleen was our board president at one time, fairly recently here, and you may know that she is the communications officer for our state health department. You may not know that because Colleen was willing and able to borrow a truck from her uncle, she and Janice Cheney took me to seminary however many years ago. And I think that sense of this community going with me and taking me there made it possible for me to sustain not being here for all those years. So thank you for that, Colleen, and I'm honored to welcome you up.
Well, I like the opportunity to put my thoughts together because normally my thoughts are just completely random and I kind of talk about them, but when you actually have to get up here and explain them, it makes you focus a little bit. And also, I know for sure 3 printers, perhaps 4, in my house, none of which are hooked to a computer, so I wrote it out longhand. I don't know if I can read my writing because it's been so long, but anyway, so here we go. So, Jesusian Earthism. I have talked here about Earthism before. It is not a word that Spellcheck likes. Spellcheck does not like Jesusian either, but I have beat my computer into submission, and they now think that they are words. And I'm an English major, so I'm entitled to make up words as I wish. So I want to talk about this concept today. It's most of the time it's what I kind of follow in my life, under the category of Unitarian Universalism. So I'm going to start with a quote by a man I've never heard of, but I really like this quote. It's from William James. I don't know if he sounds familiar at all, but he wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, another book I've never heard of, but I read it in another book. So this is his definition of religion. In its broadest terms, religion says that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in rightful relations to it. Let me read it again. In its broadest terms, religion says that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in rightful relations to it. I don't think this fellow was a Unitarian Universalist, but I like the rightful relations reference. I like the unseen order reference and the supreme good reference. They really speak to me. We have, I think, an unseen order that's captured in our principles. We certainly have, for me, it is primarily the natural world. So there is an unseen order in the natural world that we find out more and more and more about all the time, and then we realize we don't know anything about it. So it's like at one point, well, I think it may still be the theory, but scientists, physicists think that 90% of the universe cannot be seen. And the universe has mass that cannot be explained. So that's all things that we will never see, but I certainly believe in them. And I believe in the interconnectedness of all life, and that really, we've got nothing else. I mean, it's this planet, it's your brain, your heart, your connections that make up who we all are, whether we believe in Earthism or not. So I'm separating Earthism out. It was a term used by Edward Abbey, who did a lot of writing on the natural world, and that was his religion. He coined that probably back in the 50s maybe, and that was his religion. Now, he was a fairly curmudgeonly guy, and didn't like people very much, but he really liked being out and in the natural world, and some of his adventures are just like crazy, like he'd walk 20 miles with no water. You know, I mean, it was way back when people were a lot tougher than we are now. So many other naturalists feel this same way. They feel an affinity for the world, the natural world, and they do not feel an affinity for people. And sometimes it actually degrades into hostility towards people. But for me, the noun part of Jesusian Earthism is the bedrock. Okay, without it, there's nothing else. And it acknowledges the unseen order, and it acknowledges right relationship. But I don't think that Earthism is enough. I think it needs more of a definition, a description, more of a human element. Therefore, Jesusian is the modifier that I stick onto Earthism. And this is going to be a stretch for some people, and it's a stretch for me too, but this is the reason I picked Jesusian as a modifier is what I'm going to explain to you right now. So come along with me, stay with me. So as a kid, I grew up in a Lutheran church here in Bismarck, and I just loved Jesus. Oh my goodness! First of all, he was cute, you know that, and you know, and he was really nice to kids, and he was. I really believe that song, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in His sight, and it was all good. Said my prayers every night, it was all good. Then came catechism, and that is where the trouble began, because now you had to learn about other things that made no sense. I had trouble explaining grace, I had trouble explaining just a lot of things that were involved in the teaching of Christianity. And the way my church defined it, and I was taught that this was it's a belief that the only way to salvation is by believing that Jesus is the only Lord and Savior. Really? That seemed pretty restrictive to me. And I do remember asking my pastor at the time, and I've told this story before, but I asked him, so the Dalai Lama, is the Dalai Lama going to hell? And he said, well, does the Dalai Lama believe in Jesus Christ as his only Lord and Savior? Well, no, I think he's Buddhist, so I don't think that's going to apply. So that's where the cracks began. I just didn't quite buy it. But on the other hand, I still had this great affection left over from my childhood. I couldn't quite let it go. And that brings us to the question of what's Jesusian, okay? Who was Jesus? There are many, many theories. One is that he didn't exist at all, did not exist at all. I don't think that's true in a way. I think that there's enough historical reference that makes it likely that he was real. There is the idea that he's an amalgamation of many prophets, and I think Hannah Balaban at one point explained to the congregation that at the time Jesus was preaching, there were a lot of other prophets that had come up because the Jews were under a lot of pressure at that point in time within their culture and relations with the Romans. There's the theory, of course, that the Christians believe that he did exist and he was the Son of God, which is just a little bit too much for me. And then there's the theory that he did exist, but he was just a dude. And that's kind of, to me, what the Gospels kind of come at, because they're talking about someone, and he just seems like a guy to me. A really cool guy, but just a man. So I didn't like the Son of God, virgin birth, way to salvation bits. But I didn't like Jesus Christ, but I liked the idea of Jesus. So Jesusian is the idea of Jesus, the idea that Jesus brought into the world. And in a way, it doesn't really matter whether he was real or not. It's that idea of what he represented that's the important thing. So the bits I did like about Jesus, who, he's just a dude, but he's a different kind of cat. He's kind to children. He helped the sick and the outcasts of society. You didn't see high priests associating, well, with prostitutes, at least not in, well, never mind. We'll just leave that one. He called out corruption, and he helped poor people. So I like what Jesus represented. What I was taught was the Old Testament was primarily about retribution, vengeance. There's a lot of smiting. A lot of smiting goes on in the Old Testament. And fear is your primary motivator. You should be afraid of going to hell. So there's lots of rules. And some of the rules are, separate your food into different categories. I mean, there's just lots and lots of rules in the Old Testament. And that's how you kind of get to a religious state. But the New Testament brought in a new idea. And that was that maybe all these rules aren't important. Maybe it's the love and the compassion that's the important part. What Jesus did and all of the radical things he did in his short life was he broke down social barriers. I mean, he was in the carpenter class, but he associated with people who were poor, lepers, prostitutes. He didn't feel that abiding by Mosaic law was necessary and that it was not the true path to God. But it was the love and compassion that was important. And this was exemplified in one of Peter's phrases that he was asked to describe who Jesus was after Jesus was dead. And he said, he went about doing good. Now that's something that we all can aspire to. If somebody gets to the end of your life and somebody says about you, you went about doing good. So in my mind, I boil, there were the 10 Commandments. That's kind of complicated and too many for me to remember. And I even have trouble with 7 principles. So I boil this down to 3 rules, which I can actually keep in my head. So the first rule that Jesus set forth, and maybe more of a suggestion really, but is love God. And as we know from the first quote, God is the unseen order. So love the unseen order. What is it? Acknowledge it. Keep it within your heart. The second rule is love your neighbor as yourself. It's getting a little trickier now. But that's the second rule. The third rule is give your talents and money to the poor and disadvantaged. Even a little bit harder. Now, I wasn't at the Bernie Sanders rally, but I listened to it on television, and I almost felt like it was a Jesusian moment. He was preaching. He was preaching to us. And what he was preaching was very similar to what my idea of Jesusian is. So these are all simple, 3 simple rules, right? Well, that's fine, but they're really hard to follow. You'd think they'd be easier, but they aren't. They're really, really hard to follow. And I think that soon after Christ was killed and the apostles went out and started telling the world about Jesus, after a time the followers began to weaken. The Catholic Church became very powerful, became very rich. And give your talents and money to the poor. Well, yeah, we have a soup kitchen. That's good enough, love our neighbor as ourselves. Unless they're Lutherans, then we're Catholics, and we don't love Lutherans, of course, because that must have been Catholics only. And we can't love Muslims because obviously Jesus meant Christians. Well, that's not what he said. So we make these excuses for kind of backpedaling on the rules. Such that I think that Christianity that's practiced today is something that most of you probably feel is something that Jesus would probably not have much to do with. I think that the current pope is trying to take it back to that, but they've spent centuries away from it. It's going to take some time. So Jesus Christ, Christian, is not what's being practiced today. But the concept of Jesus is completely valid. It's completely instructive. And I think for me, having a childhood connection, it's comforting as well. So why did I throw in Jesusian with Earthism? Because I'm perfectly happy with Earthism. That's me. But I think that Earthism talks about the natural world, but it doesn't really have necessarily a very human element in it, which allows people to accept the natural world, but not accept their fellow human beings, or to think that their fellow human beings are less. We can respect the earth, and we can hate other religions, we can accept the wonder of science, and we can practice greedy behavior. So to temper Earthism, I throw Jesus on top. It's kind of like a sundae, you know. So with Jesus or Buddha or whoever, we add humanity. We add the part about loving God, the unseen order, okay, loving our neighbor, and helping people. And those go together to bring out our supreme good and get us to get in right relations with that. So even though it sounds funny, it's what I try to follow, and it's really not easy. I mean, it's really, really not easy. When I take it to the extremes, I feel very guilty sometimes for my good life, because there are so many people who don't have that. And it's not, I think that's also a good thing to throw on top of Earthism, is that, yes, the earth is wonderful, but there are also human problems in it, and we need to acknowledge those. I want to go back to reading the definition, because I do really, really like it. And I'll close with this. In its broadest terms, religion says that there is an unseen order, and that our supreme good lies in rightful relations to it. Thank you.
Deep peace of the running wave to you. Deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace of the shining stars to you. Deep peace of the infinite peace to you.